Okay, so why don't we welcome everybody back? I'm going to start us for our second half of the conference right now. We're going to go with Dr. Jessica Maier, and then we will have our panel discussion with Bruce McCacken and Carol Spack. First of all, I am delighted to welcome Dr. Jessica Maier to our talk today. As an art historian and author, she teaches art history with a focus on the European Renaissance, Baroque art and architecture, and with an eye to global interactions. In Dr. Maier's research and in the classroom, she focuses on traditionally overlooked categories of imagery, such as prints, illustrated books, maps, and city views. Her research on the Renaissance cartography and print culture has been a focus, and she holds a PhD from Columbia University and is a recipient of major fellowships from the American Academy in Rome and the National Endowment for the Humanities. Her articles have appeared in national and international publications such as the Art Bulletin, Renaissance Quarterly, Imago Mundi, along with numerous others. Her most recent book is The Eternal City, A History of Rome in Maps, published by the University of Chicago Press. And she has very graciously found an opportunity to offer all of us a discount on not only her book, but all University of Chicago Press publications. So if you go to their website, the University of Chicago Press Publications, I'll put it in the chat, you can get 30% off, everybody, with the code UCPNEW. I'll put all of that in the chat as well. In her talk with us today, Rome's urban history through maps and views, she will introduce us to a series of maps and bird's eye views that tells Rome's history across the ages. From ancient marble tablets to Renaissance prints and to modern tourist plans, these works allow us to trace the evolution of a city that has had many lives and incarnations over its 3 millennia of existence. Dr. Maier, please take it away. We're delighted to have you.
Thank you, Courtney. Can you all hear me okay?
Yes.
Great. I'm delighted to be here with you today. Thanks so much for that nice introduction. I'm smiling as I look around the faces that I can see on Zoom because I know I'm among friends. I can see like on your walls and like the globes, if I buy another, oh, thank you. That's great. I wish I could sign it for you through Zoom. But if I buy another globe on any of the online places, I think my husband's going to kill me. They're my latest like passion. But my pocketbook can't quite keep up with my passion, so they're minor but wonderful things. Anyway, I'm really happy to be here with you. This is special for me because I'm not actually used to talking to people who are really into maps. Like I'm used to talking to people who are really into Rome, and maybe some of you like me are really into both. But it's a really special opportunity. So I'm really grateful for the invitation to talk to you today. I'm gonna, without further ado, I like to talk, so I'm gonna share my screen before I start falling behind immediately. Let's see. Sorry, just bear with me 1 second. And you're going to see my messy, well, maybe I can do it so that you don't actually see my whole messy screen. One forewarning, I have 3 small children, and I am currently in the same house with them. So if we're interrupted, I apologize in advance. They don't really understand semi-professional occasions, so they don't really like to honor them. In any event, so this is the title and the title image of my talk today, Rome's Urban History Through Maps. And Courtney and I both thought it might be kind of interesting, given this audience in particular, to talk about my background and kind of how I got here. So it's some of the stuff is pretty publicly accessible, like as Courtney gave some of my professional background. And here, if you were to, Google me and look me up with my institution, as Courtney mentioned, I teach at Mount Holyoke College. You would see something kind of like this, although they recently changed the website, much for the worse. But you would get kind of my official credentials and background. You will, of course, see lots of cartography and maps, right, in the description of my research interests. There it is again. You'll also see that my books are about maps of Rome, of which there are now two, and here they are. Rome Measured and Imagined was published in 2015, and that one came out of my dissertation research, and really focused on maps of Rome from the late Middle Ages through the 16th century, with a little bit of foray beyond and before, because you have to put everything in context. And then more recently published in 2020, The Eternal City, A History of Roman Maps, which was more what I hoped would be a kind of accessible version, and that moves across time and slightly better illustrated. And it covers Rome through maps, basically from its earliest days to the present. And in a way, in a kind of really quick sketch, that's a little bit of what I'm going to try to give you a taste of when I get around to my talk today. But as Courtney kindly pointed out, yes, I was able to get a discount code. So if you're interested in either of these titles, and in fact, I believe it's good on any title that in the catalog of University of Chicago Press. And a lot of you might know that they have some great cartography. So please, even if you don't buy my book, use it and get, add to your library. I love discounts on books. So one thing you will not find in that catalog, and that I can't offer you a discount on or anything else, are books that are a little less known and you're not going to find on my CV or resume, or good luck finding them, I think, anywhere. These are also my work, although I can't actually recall if my name appears in them. And this is a little insight onto where I came to my experience with and love for maps. And that is actually that my first job right out of college, completely randomly, I graduated from college a long time ago, and I moved to New York, and I had been an art history and Italian studies major and went looking for a job. I wanted to work in an art gallery, the only gallery that gave me an interview. And following that, a job was the Graham Orator Gallery, which some of you might have heard of in New York City. So I spent 2 years working full-time for Graham Orator. I know he's kind of a polarizing figure. If you've heard of him, a lot of map people have heard of him. And I'm not going to get into, all of the controversies that have surrounded him. I will say, though, that I worked for him 2 years full-time, and then six, depends how you count, maybe 6 to 8 years more part-time, minus a couple years where I was in Italy doing dissertation research. And I will say just a few positive things in Graham's favor. He had the most amazing collection of maps and atlases I've almost ever encountered. And so I had the real privilege of being able to just leaf through atlases, leaf through a 1482 Ptolemy and take pictures of, things that were just so spectacular that I was bowled over, because you never see these things in a college classroom. Although I'm trying to change that with my own college students at times, but still, it was one of those experiences that kind of changes your path forever. And so I fell in love with these objects, and I realized quickly that sales wasn't really my destiny or my strength. Well, but it was all about writing, right? If you've read any of Graham's descriptions of maps, if they're really well written, they're probably date back to to me. Um, in any event, when I went to graduate school, that's Columbia's art history building over on the right. When I went to graduate school, um, I, it took me a little while to realize that I didn't need to study like Michelangelo and Raphael, that I could continue studying, that I could bring this passion for cartography to my research and to my graduate study. So some examples that I wrote a seminar paper in my first 2 years there on Durer's hemispherical world map, which is pretty unusual. It's in the form of a globe, right? It's not really per se hemispherical, but as some of you probably know, it's a globe in 2 dimensions, essentially. And I wrote a paper on that. That's a long time ago, so I get fuzzy on the details after a while. I wrote my master's thesis on Ortelius's Parergon, the historical section of the Theatrum. And then when it came time to find a dissertation topic, I wanted to combine my love of Italy with my love of maps. I wanted to go do research in Italy, and it didn't take me too long to find some really amazing Renaissance maps of Rome. Okay, and so that's how I got to this topic. I'll come back to this map that you see on screen, this amazing groundbreaking mid-16th century map of Rome that got my toe in this regard. And I'll come back to it. But for now, let me just say it worked. It got me where I wanted to be, which was in Rome for 2 and then 3 years. And it got me really looking very hard at maps and how they developed over that time, and also how a city developed and was documented through maps. And so that brings me to my topic, finally, Rome's urban history through maps and views. Rome, right? There's really no place quite like it. Rome is, for me, it was interesting as a case study, as a problem for cartography, because here you're dealing with, if you're going to map something, you have to contend with myth and legend. You have to contend with what's not there as well as what is, right? And you have to contend with all of these kind of vertical layers stratified one over the other. How do you do this in 2 dimensions, and how do you do it before, well, you can almost do it better before modern map making techniques and standards of accuracy really come into play. But as a kind of case study and a problem for cartography, that really fascinated me and continues to fascinate me to this day. And I think that in many ways, Rome kind of brings together all the problems that mapping any city brings into play, right? Because so many, it's kind of like the mother of all cities in many ways. And some of these challenges, I would say in varying degrees, are true in almost every city that you will encounter and see represented on paper or digitally or in a model or what have you. So I'm going to do a whirlwind kind of tour through some maps that I picked out and I'll go vaguely chronologically, or I will go chronologically. And one premise of my book, The History of Roman Maps, is that there isn't just one Rome, right? There are so many different Romes, and every map captures a different Rome. And so I will, however, explore some of these Romes in the little time that remains to me. So Courtney, can you remind me when I should plan to wrap up? You're muted, sorry.
Hi, you should wrap up about 11:45, but then
and that will leave time for questions or discussion.
That's the total. That's the total.
That's the total. Okay, so I will start the whirlwind tour now.
Yeah,
20 minutes. So okay. Okay. Here is Rome in a satellite picture, and I just want to start with a tiny bit of orientation for those of you There's probably a variety, of familiarity with this city. Rome from a satellite, it has some pretty recognizable features, and I want to point them out because they'll show up again and again in some of the maps that I'm showing you. And if I forget to point them out, at least you'll have this background and this orientation, because as many of you probably know, it wasn't standard to orient maps to north until modern times. And this goes for city maps also, maybe even more so. So for hundreds and hundreds of years, maps of Rome were oriented with north at the upper left. Okay, so you're going to see, so keep your eye on the river, because it's the river that's going to shift, right, so to speak. So here's the Tiber flowing north to south. And other features that I can pick out here are Rome's 3rd century city walls, which are still largely intact. And of course, city walls are a real kind of an important boundary for any city up until modern times, when they get to be somewhat obsolete, at least as a defensive device. But Rome continues to have a remarkably intact set of walls. And it's not the first set of walls for the city. So another thing to keep in mind is that is the topography, the famous topography of Rome. With this overlay, I'm showing you the original 7 hills, okay, the famous 7 hills of Rome, and also an earlier set of walls, which you see here, this circuit, which I will get back to in a moment, but also later additional famous hills across the river, like the Janiculum or the Vatican. And so this is just a little bit of the topography that I will be referring back to as I go along. In myth, right, Rome's earliest days date back to the 8th century BCE. And that is actually April 21st, 753 BCE is the legendary founding of Rome. And it is the date that is typically cited as the date that these famous twins, Romulus and Remus, fought with each other over the right to found this new city and name it after themselves. And we all know who won, because it's called Rome, not Reem. So it's not, Romulus defeated his brother, killed him, and then laid out legendarily the first set of walls on the Palatine Hill. Okay, and in fact, archaeology kind of backs up that the earliest settlements were here. Whether or not the legend is true, I'm not going to solve that problem today. So the earliest set of walls, nothing remains of the original set of walls. The next set of walls, the Servian wall, which I showed you overlaid over the satellite a moment ago, we have more to go on. So there's archaeological evidence for these walls. I'm showing you some fragments of it near the train station, Termini train station, and in fact, right inside Termini train station in McDonald's, ironically, right? You can eat your quarter pounder next to the remains of Rome's second set of city walls, the Servian wall. The third set of walls dates from much, much later, right? The better part of a millennium later. So jumping ahead to the 3rd century, the Aurelian wall was first built in the 270s, and then it was added to, raised in height later. And here is a great photo of one of the most intact stretches of this wall, which, as I mentioned, is still, you can still see a lot of it with your own eyes today. One map that I'm very fond of that tries to capture some of this unfolding history in a single sheet is this 16th century map by the Dutch scholar Paulus Merula. And if you look closely, okay, so here's the river. North, as I forewarned, is at left, And you have one set of walls at the very center, a second set of walls that billows outward from there, and then a third set of walls, right, stretching further still. So it's kind of like almost an allegory of the city's growth over time, including actually also the later Vatican city walls, which were dated post-antiquity, after that part of the city became important as Christianity came to dominate Rome's government and identity. That's also the period where the Roman Republic and then the Empire, Rome is under its greatest power, right? And the next map I want to show you reflects the ancient Rome at its height. And Rome, of course, was this, as a city, was the capital of an empire. You have emperors. Sorry, I have one of my kids is yelling in the background. The usual
We've
suspects.
all been there.
Right, that's just one. There are three. Anyway, it's like, do your worst. So here's Augustus, right? I had a little too much fun in Photoshop, but lavishing attention on the city. And this is when Rome is much more than a city, right? It's the hub of a great empire. And some of you are probably familiar with the Poitinger table, named after a collector from much later. And in fact, this is a medieval map. It dates from the Middle Ages on parchment, but it is thought to be a very faithful reproduction or copy of a 4th century Roman road map. Okay, and I'm sure that this is one of those monuments that probably many of you have encountered, if you know, in here and there. This I want to show you in particular. I'm only showing you one tiny section of it. Actually, it's a very long strip map, and I wanted to show you the section that in fact includes Rome. Okay, because what you have here is the perfect visualization of this sense that all roads lead to this city. And in fact, it is the Roman roadmap. And with this, and I hesitate to call it a map of Rome. It is a personification of Rome. It is not a city map in the way we would think of city maps today, of course, right? It's not measured per se. And it isn't even physical. It's not a physical surveyed depiction of the city. However, it kind of sums up the identity of the city as the center of everything. And you can see these roads in red, right? All leading both in towards Rome as this magnetic center, but also outward to all of these far-flung parts of the empire. The Middle Ages, right? Rome becomes a very different kind of city. Number one, the population collapses drastically, right? This is, but when I signed on, I heard people talking about the Dark Ages, and I always teach my students that the Middle Ages are a period of incredible cultural achievement. Okay, and so even if it's a population that's less and less urban during that time, so cities get smaller, you have incredible feats of of literature, of philosophy, and of cartography. And so an example would be the Ebsdorf Mappa Mundi from about 1300, right? There are arguments about the dates, there are arguments about many things, even the function. But this map that was from Northern Europe, right, and produced in the late Middle Ages and was destroyed, I believe, in World War II as a kind of victim of bombing, is one of those really incredible medieval achievements. So again, I want to stay focused on Rome here. But that's not Rome, what I just circled for you, right? This is really a Christian topography, a Christian worldview, and not just a worldview, but a kind of a Christian universal view, right? This is a depiction of the entire, all of creation, right? And humankind's place in it. And Jerusalem is literally at the center, okay? This isn't really a spatial depiction of the world. That will come later. And it's a version of a TO map, something that many of you are probably familiar with where the world's divided into 3 continents. You have Europe at the bottom, Africa at right, Asia at the top, and that places Rome right about here. So let's have a closer look. This is how Rome is depicted on this map. And if you can see the city wall, and it's really smoothed out into a very regular oval. This is the River Tiber going through it with a bridge, okay? A lot of the ancient Roman bridges had been flooded away or fallen into disrepair. You have St. Peter's, and every other building that you see is a church. Okay. And that shows you that what was seen as key to the city and its identity was its Christian topography, right? Rome here is a city of churches and nothing else, right? It's highly selective, but the nature of those selections are revealing. There's also a lion. The meaning of the lion is debated. I don't want to dip my toe into that one. But here this is the city, right, where pilgrims are flocking to the city, right? Its population might have sunk considerably, but this is a city that is increasingly a destination for pilgrimage. And that map that shows Rome as a city of churches reflects that identity and reflects the pilgrimage experience. However, we also do have pilgrimage guides that talk about some of the ruins, but talk about them almost as sites of Christian martyrdom, right? Frame it in a really Christian manner. Here is another map from around not too long after that also shows Rome, and this one is an amazing contrast from the same period, but such a different view, much more comprehensive, much more plan-like. Okay, limits of time will keep me from fully walking you through it, but north is here. You can maybe make out the river snaking its way through the city, and then the city walls. Again, they're pretty smoothed out, but within you have streets, you have many individual monuments, some of them are labeled, and this map is in many ways, although not surveyed, an impressively detailed kind of precursor of the plans that will come later. Moving into the Renaissance, and as you can see, I'm using the idea of maps loosely. I do look at bird's eye views constantly. Sometimes they actually had a measured base, right? So the idea of measured accuracy can certainly come into it. But the notion of a representation that tries to relate the whole to the parts, right? And do so often in a spatial manner, is something that I think really lets us look at bird's eye views as well as maps at this time. So this anonymous painted view, okay, I wanted to show this is what Rome had contracted to, okay? This stippled part here is the population density of the city, and you can see that it had shrunk away from the walls. And if you use that tidbit of information and look at this view, the city walls, we're looking from the um, east, right, over towards, here's the Pantheon, there's the Vatican, and all of this green space, right, shows how the city had contracted over the centuries to a core of density that's like an island, right, there in the middle. It's that island that you see on the woodcut from the Nuremberg Chronicle in 1493, right? One of these early landmarks of print, which really focuses on the inhabited parts of the city and kind of cuts out the parts that had grown more abandoned and more overgrown, so to speak, over time. But here, if you look in the distance, we're actually looking at a city that's on the rise, right? A city where there's this colorful variety, where St. Peter's is rising in the distance. There are also ancient monuments like the Pantheon, which you see here. Here's a corner of the Colosseum. This was a time of major urban revival where the popes come in and begin to, or the popes return from a kind of self-imposed exile in Avignon, France, and they begin to repair aqueducts, improve the infrastructure, the streets, bridges, build new bridges, and a lot of urbanistic projects as well as architectural ones. And I think that this wonderful woodcut view from the Nuremberg Chronicle really captures some of that excitement of a city that is in renewal. Also from the Renaissance is the map that got me into my dissertation topic, and that was the subject of the longest chapter, and that's Leonardo Buffalini's map from 1551. This is a huge item. There are only two intact surviving examples at the Vatican and at the British Library. This is the British Library's copy that I'm showing you. It is a huge item. As I said, it's over 6 feet by 6 feet, or 2 meters by 2 meters. And what really makes it special is that it is an orthogonal ground plan, right? It is a measured footprint of the city. It was based on survey. And so, for example, in this part, the most densely inhabited part of the city, the island, as I called it a moment ago, you have an accurate measured ground plan, okay? And at a remarkable degree of accuracy, considering they're basically using like a magnetic compass to execute compass surveys, and then measuring distances most often through pacing, right? Incredibly labor intensive survey. And so the degree of accuracy is actually pretty impressive. But alongside that, you have some monuments, if you look at this section, that are not completely imagined, but almost completely imagined. And so that combination of this Renaissance love of antiquity and a kind of creative, imaginative take on antiquity next to this really serious desire to measure the city. So we're seeing maps change along with the city. The real successor to Buffalini is Giambattista Noli, whose famous Plan of Rome set a completely new standard of measured accuracy, right? He's doing trigonometric survey. He's using much more advanced instrumentation. If you look at the built environment, right, this map actually holds up against modern computer maps. It's incredibly, it's quite an achievement in the realm of scientific cartography. However, it was also a map that was geared towards an audience of grand tourists. So it has all of these decorative flourishes in a way that kind of betrays that audience for it, right? This was a really elite souvenir for wealthy grand tourists who were flocking to Rome at the time. You get into the modern era when you start getting tourist plans of a much more modest sort, right? The kind that until recently you'd see any tourist walking around with. Now everyone's glued to their phone, right? Which I didn't bring in a kind of chapter on phone on that kind of apps and mapping. But here is a tourist plan. It has monuments, both Christian and secular. It has the train station, right, which is how many of these tourists got into the city. So all of these new features, a street index, and it was not. We're out of we're in the era where maps become wayfinding tools and become practical tools at the same time. I'll go through the last ones quickly because time is really coming to a close. But after 1870, Rome becomes the capital, and you get maps that show a vision for the future, right? So the master plan shows new neighborhoods that were to be built, new bridges that were to be constructed, and many of which eventually were. A lot of this, however, wasn't realized, and that begs the question, right? Thinking about the chapter that is now, right? That portion of Rome is one tiny portion of the city as it stands today. It has finally far outgrown its original or its 3rd century city walls. And the most recent maps that I talk about in my book and that I think tell us a lot about the evolution of the city are those that are trying to deal with all sorts of urban problems that any great metropolis has to deal with today, right? Sustainability, and mass transit, and connectivity, and unchecked growth. So I will leave it there, and I'll stop my share, and hopefully there's at least a few minutes for questions. I'm sorry to go through that so very quickly. I always bring in more material than any business doing.
Rich presentation, Jessica. Thank you so much.
You're very welcome.
It's so wonderful to have a fellow map enthusiast among our midst. I see that John Jablonski had a question about any idea how many Noli maps were printed?
I don't actually have an answer for that. I just know I probably once knew that, but many, many more, I think, than were printed of earlier ones. So you can still find them, right? So, and I say anecdotally because you can still find them available on the market at times, and whether they were joined, right, because it was in many, many sheets, or whether they were in a folio, and versus someone like Buffalini where you don't see them. I suspect it was between 500 and 1,000, but that's a really big window, and someone else might have a better idea.
I see James Jeffrey had a question. James, do you want to pop on?
I think I can see it in the chat there. The name of the map presented after Buffalini of 1551. Let me just, after Buffalini, what did I show? I showed, Romolo Bulla, the plan guide of Rome, the first tourist plan, if that's what you mean. I think that was the next one I showed, and I can put it right into the chat here. Okay.
Thank you.
You're welcome.
Any other, I mean, such a rich presentation. There's so much to.
I hope it's not a total blur.
Well, no, it's great. I'm just trying to think. Anyone else have a question that they wanted to pop in or raise their hand? People are feeling a little shy. Tom, I know you probably have one.
Oh, I'm sure. Are your slides going to be available? It was fascinating.
I'd be very happy to make them available, and I will. I can convert. Usually, what I do is I convert them to a PDF because they're big, and then I'll forward them to Courtney, and maybe she can post them. And okay, so
Douglas,
how many years did you work for Graham?
I worked, I worked, so it depends what you consider, 2 years full-time, and then probably on and off for 8 years part-time. So I was really the veteran in the New York setting at a certain point, but I will say he helped me escape graduate school without debt, which was kind of an amazing thing. And he was a very supportive. So I will also say that he was really like he's an interesting guy, and I know he's earned his share of controversies. And but he was a real supporter of my research, and he kept trying to bribe me not to go back to grad school though, and to keep working. um,
I just saw that Douglas had a question. I was trying to unmute you, Doug, if you wanted to share it with us live. Going to ask you to unmute. Doug, hold on. I'm trying to get you to unmute.
I could maybe start the ball rolling because I think if it's what I see in the chat, it's about the University of Oregon, the presentation of Noli's panoramic map of Rome at the University of Oregon, which is briefly at Stanford. So there are a few different things. There's the Noli website that was a University of Oregon project, and I actually taught for a year at the University of Oregon, so I got to know the person who was responsible for that really useful website. Then they also had a show at the University of Oregon that had Vazzi's map of Rome, which is a panoramic view. But the Noli website was died a brief death when Adobe Flash was done away with, and a lot of websites bit the dust when Adobe Flash stopped being supported. But it's been revived through this kind of collaboration with Stanford, Dartmouth, and the University of Oregon. And I've actually contributed to it. I contributed an essay to it. And I will, full disclosure, my husband is also a scholar. He's an architectural historian, and he's an expert on Rome, and he is one of the partners in that project. So a little bit of Rome as a kind of family business. And someone asked, how often do I get back to Rome? Not as often as I'd like. I haven't been since before COVID, which kills me, because it really feels like I lived there for 3 years. I love it. And my husband has a lot of family there. But both COVID and then having 3 kids under 10, travel has been hard. But we're hoping to go live there in a few years if we can both get a sabbatical at the same time. And we were in Florence a few years ago, which isn't Rome, but it's also a really great city. And I was kind of won over to Florence more than I thought I would be. But I love Florence too. So that was probably the last time I went to Rome, was when I was living in Florence for a year.
Wow, it's such a wonderful opportunity, and our fingers are crossed that happens for you. What an amazing chance to live abroad and to have your kids have that experience as well. Thank you so much for your incredible presentation. It was great to understand how you came to what you did, and also to understand and to see sort of the richness of your research and the depth and passion you're bringing to these topics and illuminating it for all of us. So thank you, thank you, thank you.
It's my pleasure. Thank you for having me.
Absolutely. And so thanks, lots of clapping happening in the background.